and asked for fingerprinting, but in the meantime, the judge started handling the bag himself without gloves. And he called over members of the prosecution and the customs officers who all came over and handled the bag, despite the Corbys, calling for it to be untouched and fingerprinted. And then he later said that, the inner bag couldn't be fingerprinted either because too many people had touched it.
Look, can we just pause right there? I just think this is a really important point, and I wish we had a lawyer on this show, because I suspect that if that happened in a court here, that would be a case for a mistrial or a retrial or something, wouldn't it? I mean, under our system of law, if something like the inability of the police to get any kind of forensic evidence other than circumstantial evidence, and then to basically make it impossible to get that evidence, to tamper with it in a sense, really... but I'd really just like to have a lawyer to confirm that. But it seems to me that under our system, that would be grounds for some kind of mistrial right there.
Well, I would think so. They certainly went out of their way to make sure that no evidence, that Schapelle would not be able to get any evidence to support her innocence in Bali. This is interesting because in denying her that evidence to prove her innocence, they were also denying themselves that same evidence to prove her guilt.
Right.
Indonesian law requires that you have some form of secondary evidence with which to back up primary evidence. Obviously, the primary evidence was the marijuana, and they needed some sort of secondary evidence in order to back up that primary evidence in order for the courts to be able to convict Schapelle. And all these sorts of things like fingerprinting, weighing of the bags, and of course the other important point which you haven't touched on yet is the forensic testing of the marijuana. Had Schapelle been guilty, all these things would have gone against her and would have more than provided them with the secondary evidence they required.
Okay, let's move on to the forensic testing of the marijuana then. So was this another thing that was requested from Schapelle's team?
Yes, it was requested from Schapelle's team, and Schapelle actually signed an authorization allowing the Australian Federal Police to forensically test the marijuana to determine its country of origin. And you have to remember that in a situation like this, the AFP have no real jurisdiction in Indonesia, and their only brief in a situation like that is to assist the prosecution. So she was basically taking a risk by asking for that, because had it proven that the drugs were from Brisbane, it would have given the prosecution a prima facie case, would have gone very much against her. And had during the process of that forensic testing, they found hair or skin fragments in the bag, and tested them and found that they matched Schapelle's DNA, she would have had no choice but to change her plea to guilty, basically. But they decided not to do any of that. In fact, they not only refused to do it in Indonesia, but they actually refused to give the Australian Federal Police a sample of the marijuana for testing.
Okay, so it looks like they're ruling out all of the kind of standard forms of forensic examination. Now, what's left is circumstantial evidence, correct?
Well, basically, yes.
Okay. I want to get into this whole question of circumstantial evidence and exactly what they have provided. We're just going to have a very short break, and we'll be right back and get into that.
Okay.
Propaganda, disinformation, misinformation, deception, deceit, spin, untruths, half-truths, lies. You know the truth. Looking for something different? Visit Truth News Radio Australia. www.truthnews.com.au.
Okay, well, we're back with Truth News, and we're back with the Schapelle Corby story, miscarriage of justice, as it has been proclaimed by many people, including some quite renowned songwriters, and we're going to have play a sample of one of those songs. And I have with me tonight Roy Reeves, who's a close friend of the Corby family, and we're going through some of the evidence that could basically either prove guilt or innocence. And what we've come up with is that it looks like a systematic approach was taken from the police and the courts to strip Schapelle of any kind of forensic evidence that might have been able to prove her guilt or innocence. and what we're left with is circumstantial evidence that, well, the drugs were in her bag, and she said it was her bag, therefore she's guilty. It's pretty open and shut. As soon as you strip away all the other forms of checking, you're just left with that. And of course, I guess the case must have been pretty quick then, Roy. I mean, what was left? I guess there was character. She could have said that she's a person of good character. Did that come up in the courts as a part of her defence?
I don't believe it did come up as part of her defence. However, she did test negative to all drugs, thereby proving that she's not a drug user.
Okay.
She has no criminal history, no criminal record of any kind in Australia, and we have police certificates to prove that, AFP police certificates to prove that. She's never used illicit drugs, and as I say, the test proved that. So from that point of view, I mean, she was a law-abiding citizen in Australia, clean living young girl. She was, studying to be a beautician. She was looking after her dying father, basically doing the right thing by him. She was basically a lovely person.
Okay, and the initial trial, how long did it take before it actually went to trial after she was initially arrested?
I think she was. I think the trial started in January, from what I can recall. She was arrested in October.
January, and how long did that go on before she was finally
convicted? The verdict was handed down on the 27th of May 2005.
2005, right? Now it was in the news a lot at that time, and through 2005, and I remember during that time I was following it quite a lot because I was pretty interested in the story. And there was a lot of talk from Australia. Even John Howard spoke up about it. It seemed like the government here was trying to help her. And there was a guy who was in prison. And I think at some point he was actually flown over to Bali to testify on her behalf. Or did that happen later? Was that during the appeal?
No, that was during the trial. John Ford was flown over to Bali to testify. Of course, as you know, the Corbys were running with a defence based on the fact that there was a possibility that baggage handlers had inserted the drugs between Brisbane and Sydney, basically in Brisbane for transportation to Sydney. As we've already discussed, Schapelle was basically stripped of any evidence in Bali which she could use for a defence, and
right.
So her lawyers were sort of basically then forced to look to Australia for some way to prove her innocence, and because it is known that passengers' baggage is used on occasions to transport drugs interstate and also to import drugs from overseas, they looked at this as a possible means of defence.
Now, if we're going to run with that argument, I just need to understand the argument, because if we're saying that this was actually a drug courier gone wrong, that it mistakenly went on to Bali, or was it deliberately sent on to Bali? Can you elaborate on that? And if the bag was deliberately opened, why was that done? Because that almost sounds like it was more intentional, that someone was trying to incriminate someone. Why would that have occurred, and why would it have gone on to Bali, or was it just a mistake?
Well, the truth of the matter is that I don't personally think that the drugs were inserted in Brisbane for transportation to Sydney. And I'm not the only one who believes that. Large numbers of the Schapelle Corby supportment believe that. At the time, it was a legitimate defence because. It was known that passengers' bags had been used to transport drugs interstate. I don't believe it was on a large scale. The Wheeler report into airport security, which was conducted 4 months after Schapelle's verdict, did ascertain that cannabis is moved through Australian airports in passengers' baggage. There would certainly have been no reason for these drugs to have been inserted in Brisbane to go on to Bali. To be sold for a fraction of their street value in Australia. So I personally believe that the drugs were actually inserted in Indonesia.
Okay, so you're claiming, your